Hello, this is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, a show under the wonderful rubric of ThinkTech Hawaii that is all sponsored by J. Fidel, that wonderful mensch. Patricia Polansky, what an honor it is to have you here. I called you the Diamond of Hamilton Library, and for good reason. But first, Pat, could you please explain what does a Russian bibliographer do?
This is a name, a bibliographers used to be a term used in libraries, and it was someone that was responsible for developing collections. A lot of times nowadays we're just called library specialists, but I've always kept that name bibliographer since I'm from the older days. So it just means you're managing the collection, buying books, working with dealers, vendors, community, the faculty, the students, shaping the collection for how you want it to grow in the future, doing reference works, going to conferences, a whole range of things.
And I think, and I am a personal recipient of this and helping students to the nth degree, which you have done for me on numerous occasions, and I'm very grateful. So most people don't realize this, but you actually grew up in Hawaii. And as this show is called Journeys of the Mind, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I was born in Montana. Our family's all from Montana. And when I was 5 years old, we moved to Japan. So I lived in Japan from 1949 to 50. Then my dad was transferred to the Pentagon in DC area, and I grew up in Northern Virginia. And then we moved here in 1960 when I was still in high school. So I graduated from Kailua High School. Then I went back to Montana for 1 year to live with my grandmother to do first year of college, transferred back here to UH, and began studying Russian. And I've been here ever since.
No, you have done marvelous things, but why did you pick Russian of all languages? I mean, you're from Montana, one might think Swedish or something like this, or German, but why Russian?
My family is Irish German, so I tried to study German, but I just never got the hang of it. In high school and my first year of college, I studied French. I loved French, but when I came back to UH and signed up in the French classes, after about 2 days, the professor called me into to his office and he said, "Why are you in this French class? You're going to fail this class." I was devastated. And then he said, you better drop out. So I dropped out, and I was walking down the mall, the center of our campus, and I ran into a high school friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, why don't you come to our Russian class?" And that's how I started studying Russian. Just slew China by accident.
I mean, you are a real scholar in the field, and you focused on, Russia and Asia mostly. I mean, recently. So tell us about your work. I mean, it's prolific work, and the University of Hawaii should be known for its Pacific studies, especially in the Russian field. And after that, I'll start talking to you about some of the professors that you've worked with and helped out.
In 1977, that was like 7 years after I'd been working here in the library, I applied for a grant from the University of Illinois, and I went to in 1970, I applied for a grant, went to the University of Illinois, and it was a Slavic Library Training Institute. And that's where I really learned how to be a Russian bibliographer. So then came back to Hawaii, and then in 1977, I applied for a grant, an IREX grant, which I think, Carl, you're familiar with IREX. And that was a International Relations Exchange Board, located in Washington, D.C. And it was the only mechanism during the Soviet era where graduate students and professors could go to the Soviet Union and going off to live in Soviet Union for 7 months. And the university librarian said to me, when you go there, do something that will be useful for our library. So I decided to work on Russian voyages to Hawaii and what the Russians had written about Hawaii and the Pacific. And that's what I did for my time there. And I developed about 4,000 entry bibliography on what the Russians had written about Hawaii and the South Pacific Islands. That was my main focus for many years. And then later, I expanded into having an interest in Russia Asia connections, library connections, scholarly connections. And that's how I sort of got into Russia Asia.
Let's expand on the IREX connection, because later on, I've read an article about you which talks about that IREX grant that you received, where you were able to bring scholars here, and scholars from the United States went to the former Soviet Union or to Russia. Describe that, because that's, it's really important. We hear a lot about Vladimir Putin these days, but, more important is the scholarship and the understanding of the two countries historically. But tell us about that, Pat.
Well, I think I was extremely lucky to get those grants. I had three big grants. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was money in the Russian field like crazy. And everybody was helping, mostly, of course, St. Petersburg and Moscow, the European part of Russia, were getting a lot of attention. So I applied to IREX. Again, IREX was handling the money. And I was able to invite five librarians and one archivist here to Hawaii for 6 weeks, where they went to our library school. We visited many different libraries here in the state. And then also we were having our National Slavic Convention that year in Hawaii. So they were able to attend that. And we had a pre-conference that was all in Russian. My colleagues, my Russian library colleagues from Berkeley and UW and many West Coast, Stanford, Hoover, we held a little mini conference with this group in Russian, all in Russian, at the Hilton Hawaiian Village. So I thought that was great. That was interesting. So, and then I had two more grants after that. So I think we were lucky because IREX wanted to have not just focusing on the European part of Russia. So since we were out here in the Pacific and concentrating on Asia, I think that was one reason we were able to get those grants fairly easily.
You have mentioned what do you think the Russian scholars gained when they came to Hawaii? I mean, what were they focused on? Because and then I'll ask you the reverse in terms of the American scholars.
I always think we have to make two distinctions. We have to talk about the Soviet period, which is the bulk of the time here, and then after collapse of Soviet Union. So during the Soviet period, this IREX firm again was the one responsible for sending Soviet scholars to America, and many of them would ask to come to Hawaii. Well, I think they had research topics and all, but they were really more interested in going to the beach and Pearl Harbor and places like that. They did come and sit in the library, and they pretended maybe like they were working. But I think for many of them, it was like a shock. I say it was a shock because you could see in their eyes. You could always tell by their eyes. Here they were sitting in sort of a free place, and they were always like looking around and watching things, and grocery stores. I had one librarian visitor here one time who I took her to the grocery store. She was staying at the East West Center, and she had a little kitchen, so we went and bought her some food at the grocery store. Next day when she came to the library, she said she cried all night because she had never seen so much food in one place. So I don't know what they learned. I think they learned what the West was about. And I think it changed them. Many of them that I would go and meet in Moscow or Leningrad, when I would go back and reconnect with them, they were always, oh, I had a wonderful time in Hawaii and blah blah blah, and I think it was difficult for them, for people in the Soviet era to come here.
And is there a big difference? Because you mentioned the two components. And when the Russians, when it became Russia as opposed to the former Soviet Union, was there a big distinction in terms of the scholars who
Yes,
visited?
because those were mostly younger people. Of course, they'd been brought up in the Soviet era, but they were already, there were smartphones, computers. They were pretty savvy, and then they almost didn't care. Most of them didn't come to the library. They didn't come on a grant. They had their own means of coming here. Many of them had individual connections with, particularly the sciences. A lot of our science departments here did a lot of joint projects with Soviet and later Russian scholars. So they were kind of a different group.
Let me now turn a little bit. That's absolutely fascinating, and your ability to get the money to enable the scholarship not only makes my heart go pitter patter, but I'm sure the late Riasanovsky is turning favorably in his grave hearing this. Um, so my question to you is, in getting to professors, you've had the great opportunity to interact with people like Professor John White and Professor Stephan, Professor Nicholas Riasanovsky when he came here, with his, standard history of Russia, and people like from University of Washington, as sort of pronounced as Donald Treadgold. What's
Okay.
that experience been like? Because these are the guys that really shape, in many ways, the history of both the Soviet Union and Russia.
Even before this group that you have just mentioned, I also feel I was just so fortunate to meet with Klaus Maynard. And Klaus Maynard was the first person who taught Russian history here. And so I was just so glad to meet him. He came several times, just for visiting because he lived in Germany. He was in Germany, but I think all of the professors here, I was so lucky, especially John White. When I started working here in the library, I used to have to go to his office once a week and we would sit and go over. In those days, we selected books one by one from dealers' catalogs. And in the old days, the scholars, the professors were the ones that did the selecting. And so I was really there just to learn. So I would sit with John and we would go through the catalogs. He'd say, "Oh, order this one, not this one, blah blah." So I learned I just value that time so much. I learned quite a lot. And then later, when Don Raleigh and John Stephan came on into the picture, I felt more confident and I knew how to order the books and I asked them what they needed and we worked together, but they told me a brief outline of what they needed and I was able to work with them maybe on a more equal level almost than with John. But anyway, it was really great. And then those professors from the mainland, Treadgold, he was a visiting professor here, and also Basil Dimitrician, he was in Oregon in Portland, and they came and they spent a lot of time with me. Oh, you need to buy this set. You're missing this, especially about Siberia and the Far East, which is what we were focusing on. So
Yeah.
yes, I had good teachers.
You also had, the wonderful historian Louise McReynolds here, besides Donald Raleigh, for sort of the younger generation, as it were. I mean, they're not young now, but they were young then. But let me ask you this question: what did they ask of you, and what were you able to deliver to them? And let me preface this by saying, I, as a Russian history graduate student at Berkeley, went to Alan Urbanic and couldn't find an index of the newspaper I was looking at, which is called the Bell, Kolokol. And I mentioned this to you, and suddenly, a little while later, in my graduate student housing, arrived an index for Kolokol from Pat Polansky. So, what kind of wonderful things did you do for them that, of course, you did for me?
Well, I think one thing in the old days that was very important was we had an extensive exchange program with libraries all across Russia. Not out into the Far East, but we did with Siberia, even in Novosibirsk, right in the middle of Russia's Novosibirsk. So We had excellent exchange. So when Don or John Stephan would ask, they came to me and would ask me for a mentor path. See if you can find this. See if you can find that. They'd give me titles, and I'd send them off to the Russian libraries, and usually we could get them. Sometimes they would do microfilm for us, but we received a lot of material in the Soviet days directly from there. And the other most important factor was traveling to Russia. That's another thing I felt terribly lucky about. It was very easy in the old days, again through this organization IREX. If I wanted to go to Soviet Union, all I had to do was get an invitation from an institute. And we worked most closely with the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow. So I'd say, "Oh, I want to come. I want to come for a month." And so I'd get these letters of invitation, and I'd go around, visit all the libraries, and we had Hawaii had very good contacts in those days. And I used to send them a calendar every year, a Hawaii calendar every year. And every time I walked into the exchange offices, prominently displayed near their desk was always the Hawaii calendar. So I think we had a little bit of benefit, maybe compared to Harvard or Indiana and all that. You know, Hawaii was very exotic. So I think we got a lot of really good things.
Well, you mentioned travel, and you mentioned travel to Moscow, but how about recently? Can you describe, what your visits are like to Vladivostok or to the Russian, one might say the Russian Far East, or or
Well,
Russia on the Pacific?
the only time, so during the Soviet period, the furthest that I could go was Novosibirsk. That's sort of in the middle of Siberia. Nothing in the Far East. Only after the collapse of Soviet Union, where Westerners allowed to travel further. Khabarovsk, Vladivostok. I went to Magadan, Magadan, Sakhalin Island. So I always wanted to go to Kamchatka. I never got to Kamchatka. But anyway, it was much easier after collapse of Soviet Union to travel in the area that we were specializing in.
Tell us about a day in one of those cities, because I think our audience would be interested in this, really astute Russian librarian spending a day, maybe outside the archives. And what was life like for you there?
Well, again, life was different in many ways after collapse of Soviet Union. During the Soviet period and being only in Moscow and Leningrad, um, the schedules were very organized. I always had somebody minding me, somebody from the foreign section in a Dell always with me, setting up appointments. It wasn't really free on my own a lot of times, had to sneak around to see a few scholars and whatever. But after collapse of Soviet Union, I had a lot of time to myself. And so, for example, in Vladivostok, it's a beautiful city. It's almost like San Francisco. It has a lot of hills, and I could just walk around. I knew the history of the city. I could explore some of the older areas, go into older buildings. Um, there were a lot of sort of new restaurants popping up. And of course, being in the Far East, there were several Japanese restaurants. There were no Korean restaurants there yet, but Japanese, definitely Chinese, and then a few Russians. And anyway, it was good. You could go in on your own. It wasn't so much hassle or trouble. Life, I think, after Soviet Union was very good, and could see a lot of friends. Could always be in touch with people that you knew much easier. So that was a big change after the Soviet period.
I'm going to now embarrass you a bit, Russian bibliographer Polansky, because I was there when you received that wonderful Pushkin Prize, which has, at that time, had only been given to two Americans, which is, sort of the Russian equivalent of the Nobel Prize, and, given to people who have done, extensive work in the field. And what was that like for you that day? Because I remember that Ambassador Lavrov, who's still in service under Vladimir Putin. Um,
Mhm.
what was that day like for you? And I remember you chuckled because my youngest daughter Jennifer had to be checked both by the secret police of the Russians and the secret police of the United States. In her lovely red dress. Anyway, but
Yeah.
tell us what that day was like. And again. this is a tremendous award, an award rarely given to an American.
It was very interesting because, yes, Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Russian ambassador to the United States, Kislyak, were
Hmm.
here. And yeah, all the Secret Service, the State Department people, and the Secret Service. And well, the reason for it was the big APEC meeting Obama was president, and Obama had selected Honolulu for the APEC meeting, which is a big economic meeting. And so the Russians were here. But my theory is they really didn't have too much to do. I don't know, they went to the beach, or they took Lavrov wanted to go to the Big Island and see a volcano, and he did that. But my colleague from Vladivostok, Amir Hisamudinov, was here at the time, and he had said Kislyak was in Honolulu earlier in the year, and he had said to Kislyak, you need to do something for Patricia. I didn't know about this until later. And so what they came up with was this Pushkin medal. So it was a big honor. I think it was a recognition by the Russians of some of the work that we've been doing here in Hawaii. And I think they were interested. They were amused. We had a group of Russians who came to work on the Hawaiian sugar and pineapple plantations in the early 1900s. So I have the archives from that, and they were very interested to look at that.
Now there's been some, since we're talking about history, some mention of the Russian fort here, and from your perspective, and I've just read, Ilya Vinkovetsky's book about Alaska. Um, do you think the Russians had a serious intention at one point about maybe coming and staying in the Hawaiian Islands the way the Brits did and the way the Americans did?
We had a lot of contact with the Russian American company in Sitka, Alaska, and Honolulu. Ships went back and forth. And there was a shipwreck. One of the Russian American companies wrecked their ship on Kauai. And so Sitka, Baranov, the governor of the Russian American company, sent a man called Dr. Sheffer, Anton Sheffer, here to Kauai to investigate the shipwreck. And while Sheffer was on that island, he got the king, Kamoali'i, to sign over that island to the Russian Empire.
In fact, I did not know. That's an amazing fact.
But by the time Sheffer, because it took 2 years, because it was such a long trip, it took 2 years for Sheffer to finally make his way back to St. Petersburg. And by that time, the Russian government had already decided to abandon Sitka. It wasn't successful. And so I don't know whatever happened to that treaty. It's probably in an archive somewhere in Russia. But anyway, so John Stephan and I used to always say, gee, I wonder what Honolulu would have looked like if Stalin had built one of those big wedding cake buildings in Honolulu.
I'll talk to you about that, about the Russian community and the Americans who study Russia in the United States. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you also about Russian language at the University of Hawaii, which I'm sure you helped out too. And I remember taking a class from probably one of the nicest men in history, a guy named Larry Hein. He was so kind to me. My Russian proficiency at then was poor, and it got much better under his tutelage. But do you know the history of the Russian language being offered? Because I know that President Obama's mother and father met in a Russian class.
When I mentioned Klaus Maynard as the first person who taught Russian history here, there was also a professor, Denzel Carr, who taught Russian language, and that was in 1934. So that was about the 1930s. We were already teaching Russian and language and history here at this university. Anyway, then fast forward to after the war, and it was taught off and on. Russian was taught off and on, but anyway, after the war, Ella Wiswell, that's a long story. But anyway, Ella Wiswell was the founder of the Russian language program here, where she created a BA. You could get a bachelor's degree, and that was the program I went into. It was after Sputnik, And so we had the BA, 4 year Russian language BA. And that continued until about 4 years ago. And our Russian history professor, Matt Romanello, at the time, he left Hawaii to take a job on the mainland. And our UH admin swept the history position. And then the next year after that, they downgraded our Russian language program from 4 year BA to 2 year certificate. And we have one Russian language professor now, and she's teaching the 1st and 2nd year Russian. But that's all.
I bumped into a young person, I don't know, through my various nonprofit work, and he was talking about how he had taken a Russian language class from a professor named Cherbakova, and at the University of Hawaii, and how he just admired the class, and that he would stand outside the class with his professor and smoke cigarettes when it was still, okay to do that, I guess. But he was very happy about being able to take um, Russian. So, what do you think going forward that you would like to see at the University of Hawaii, maybe increasing the Russian language professors, and maybe getting a Russian history professor. I mean, one wonders why this is happening at a time when there's so much need, especially on the diplomatic front, for a U.S.-Russia relationship. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I don't know if I should bring this up, but in my opinion, one of the reasons that our bad situation has happened is because of certain people in the legislature who don't look quite favorably at the university. And a few years ago compiled a list of what they called small programs that they deemed not important, and Russia happened to be on that list. So, there's many, I don't know how one combats this. I'm waiting to see what we have now a new president of the University of Hawaii, and I don't know how she's going to approach things. The big hot topic right now is Indo-Pacific. So our Ed Case, one of Hawaii's representatives in Congress, got a big grant to organize an institute for Indo-Pacific studies here, but it doesn't include Russia. At all the big universities on the mainland where they have Indo-Pacific studies, Russia is always included. So things like that go on. So I don't know what will happen in the future. But I think life is cyclical. And I'm hoping that with our past history, somebody will come along at some point and say, we need to revive this Russian interest.
Tell us a little bit about, because this brings up this point, and it's tragic and not very far-sighted, especially with what's going on in Ukraine right now, for not to have a huge Russian department and a huge Russian history department. And by the way, in the past there was one private school here in Hawaii that had 7 years of Russian, and that was Iolani School, and hopefully they'll return
Mhm,
to that
mhm,
also.
mhm.
And
Well,
but
actually, Kamehameha and Punahou used to also teach Russian in the ancient times.
that's absolutely wonderful. I didn't know that. And
Yeah.
um, in addition to that, I think that it's what's significant about that is that our current senator, Brian Schatz, his older his let's see, is it older? Yes, his older brother Edward is a Russian scholar and teaches at the University of Toronto, I think in the political science department, but
Mm.
speaks both Russian and Kazakh, and that's because he learned his Russian at Iolani during the day.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's I'm not sure how the legislature defines small departments, but universities are supposed to be broad enough to include a lot of different and diverse angles. But um, the thing that really is significant that you mentioned is that the legislature, I think, should have sort of a broader scope. Anyway, um, tell us about the Russian community that you're part of in the organization. It used to be called AAA but it's such a small. I mean, it's a smaller group, but an interesting group from across the country. Um, that includes my former student, I think from Punahou, Michael, who's now involved with Russian studies. But like American University. You know better than I do, Pat. But uh,
Amherst, yeah.
yeah, tell us about that community and the conference that occurs, or it used to occur every year.
That's our National Slavic Organization, which is now called ACES, American. Oh, I can't even remember what the acronym stands for, but AAASS turned into ACES. Yeah, every year people meet. It's about 3,000 people attend every year. And that organization has changed a lot after collapse of Soviet Union. Before, during the Soviet period, of course, all the panels, almost every panel was on something to do with Russia. Now, it's very diverse. You know, Central Asia, all the Stan countries that are at the lower part of former Soviet Union. Um, Studies have just broadened, and you have to hunt for panels that are about Russia or Soviet Union. But it's the best place once a year to go and meet all the scholars and up and coming grad students and dealers for books, book vendors, whatever. So it's the place to always go.
One of the things that I so greatly admire about Russian scholars like John Stephan and Nicholas V. Riasanovsky is that I remember when I was at Berkeley and Nicholas Riasanovsky was invited to go and meet Mikhail Gorbachev at Stanford. And he refused because he had too much to read. And he also had to teach his classes and, staying out of the political fray, as it were. And I just so greatly admired that about of that sort of old school Nicholas Riasanovsky and John Stephan and all of, and you included in this. But I think that just alone that Pushkin Prize coming to the University of Hawaii is an example of how valuable um, you are as the diamond at the University of Hawaii, Pat. And I want to leave the last word to you, to our audience about your role here and the work that you do here. And so I'm going to be quiet and let you have the last word.
I hope that the work that I've done here will continue to be valuable in the future. We actually are much better known nationally and internationally than we are here locally. And I get requests all the time for materials. We lend out materials from our special collections. We have several special collections, especially about the time when the Russians lived in China during the interwar period. Uh, our Russian emigre collection's quite well known. So I hope in the future, if the university wants to revive interest in Russia, there'll already be a nice foundation here, I think.
It is my hope that the Hawaii State Legislature and the new wonderful president of the University of Hawaii will look kindly on the whole Russian department, that whether that be language or history, or that wonderful birth of joy and brilliance coming from that diamond, Patricia Polansky. Patricia Polansky, Russian bibliographer, we are so grateful for your time today. This is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind under ThinkTech Hawaii and a hui ho.
Thank you. Thank you.